Greetings everybody and welcome to episode 10 of the Risk 4.0 video blog series. Now in this particular episode we're going to look at how to build up a natural systemic resilience within modern organizations. And we're going to use complex systems theory as the reference lens for doing that. Now, the concept of resilience, particularly resilience to disruption, has been around for a while. It probably started gaining its most traction around about 2010, when we saw a lot of the academic journals and thought papers start talking about this concept of digital disruption. And basically what was happening is we were warning modern organizations that they needed to start building in a personal resilience to disruptive technologies and cyber disruption. And this sort of became the main theme for about 4 or 5 years. But by about 2016, the argument had evolved a little bit into what became known as the fourth industrial revolution. And now it was no longer just about digital disruption. It was about broad mainstream disruption. We were expecting our working world to change rapidly because of smart technologies, big data, data analytics, autonomous machinery, and the like. And we were being warned by 2016 that organizations needed to start building in a resilience to wave after wave of momentum disruptive changes. Then around about 2020, we got a masterclass in personal disruption, where the whole world was disrupted by the COVID pandemic and the great lockdown. And we started to experience disruption not just at organizational level, but at societal level. Now, when all the gates and the doors and the borders started opening up again, we started seeing in 2022 an absolute plethora of new thinking, new articles, documents, research papers, books, all talking about how we needed to future-proof or prevent ourselves from future disruption. And most of it was talking about this concept of building a natural resilience. And if you just basically take the common message amongst all of them, what they was telling us is that our working world has become far too volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous to plan for specific threats. In fact, achieving a natural resilience to all forms of disruption needs to be the new requisite for organizational risk management. And if you go into a deeper dive with some of these thought pieces that are out there, what we can actually start to see is that the thinking around risk management, the requisite for risk management, the goal of risk management, seems to have shifted in recent years. For the longest time, we were being taught that risk management was about identifying, quantifying, and prioritizing select threats and building standardized risk solutions around that. This thinking seems to have evolved a little bit in recent times. And now what we're seeing the literature tell us is that the purpose of risk management is to actually build in a natural resilience to all forms of disruption, regardless of probability, quantity, or perceptions. So resilience, just like disruption, has been a bit of a buzzword for the longest time, and everybody seems to have a different view about it. So it's important that before we proceed, we understand what we mean when we talk about resilience. So perhaps the oldest and truest definition of resilience is the one that comes from the natural complex systems world, whereby resilience is the ability of a natural system to intelligently prepare for and respond to environmental changes. And that, of course, may include threats, crises, and chaos. So resilience has a very strong relationship with enterprise risk management and strategic risk management, and we need to start understanding how to bring resilience into that fold. Now, the question you may be asking is, well, why natural complex systems views of resilience specifically, as opposed to any other? Well, the fact is natural complex systems have been around for billions of years. And in that time, they have endured numerous mass scale disruptive events. So there's a lot of people looking into what makes natural complex systems specifically resilient and how can modern organizations actually adopt some of those characteristics. So if you've ever read up on natural complex systems and their resilience, you may have learned that there are essentially four primary characteristics of a natural complex system which help enable their resilience. And I'm now going to talk about each in turn. So the first one is the concept of awareness, and this is the ability to recognize the emerging signals of potential environmental changes. Now, if we look to the natural complex systems world, a very good example of a particular species that uses awareness for their own personal resilience would be meerkats. You've probably seen all those videos of meerkats standing up on their legs, scanning the Serengeti or scanning wherever they may be, looking for threats. And essentially what they're doing is they're looking for changes in their environment. They're looking for variances, and they do it in what's known as a resilient neural network, which is essentially a mass scale radar. So you'll see hundreds, possibly thousands of meerkats standing up on their mounds, looking for changes, hyper alert, hyper aware. And when one of them spots a potential threat or a signal telling them that there is some sort of disruption coming along, they all react almost immediately as a single complex entity. They all dive into the hole. You don't see them doing it one at a time in drips and drabs. It's almost instantaneously. All of them dive into their hole immediately. Now, to give you an example of where disruption has occurred in the modern organizational world because of a lack of alertness for change or awareness for disruption, probably one of the best case studies I'm aware of is that of Encyclopedia Britannica. So for those of you who are privileged enough to remember, before the internet, Wikipedia and Google, if you wanted to research something, you either went to a library or you had a set of encyclopedia reference books. Now, for more than 200 years, the world leader by far was a company called Encyclopedia Britannica. They were a prestige status symbol. If you had them in your office or in your school or in your library, that was very much a status symbol. And they were the trusted source for information. Then around about 1994, Microsoft approached them and said, why don't we take your database and put it onto an electronic platform, a CD-ROM or a website or something? The board of Encyclopedia Britannica turned around and said, no, for 200 years we have manufactured books, beautifully bound, prestigious books. That's our brand. That's what we do. And they sent Microsoft on their way. Microsoft then went to a lesser known encyclopedia company called Microsoft and Carter and gave them the same deal and took all their information online. And within 2 years or 3 years, Britannica had to file for bankruptcy. That's how quickly they were disrupted. And what essentially had happened is that the Britannica board had failed to recognize both the potential and the rising popularity of electronic media, also, as well as the internet and search engines. The need to go digital with that information did just not occur to Encyclopedia, and they were caught out. Their lack of awareness and alertness for change is what caught them out. So awareness for environmental shifts and variances is a super important part of building up resilience in modern organizations. The second characteristic as such is that of readiness, the ability to prepare for pending changes by minimizing vulnerabilities and maximizing opportunities. And a good example of this in the natural system world would be those animals that spend their time preparing for a rainy day or a particular seasonal event. So these animals are intelligently responsive to change. We see big animals moving to higher ground when they sense a rain event or flood is coming. We see birds prepare to migrate literally thousands, 3,000 to 5,000 of miles to go from a winter environment to a summer environment and vice versa. We see squirrels preparing for winter and preparing to go into hibernation by collecting nuts and opportunities during the warm time. So there are species of animals that have built their resilience through continued preparation, continued readiness. And this has made them incredibly resilient to disruptive forces. Now, in the organizational world, two good examples of organizations that were disrupted because of the lack of readiness for change would be Blockbuster and Kodak. So I'll have a look at Blockbuster first. They, in 2015, were the world's largest video franchise. They had a particular model where they had thousands of franchisees in strip malls, shopping malls, that kind of thing, basically hiring out videos. And it was a low cost model because they had no major overheads and they were just getting franchise fee. And that was their greatest strength. And that's how they rose to the top. Thousands of franchisees paying in fees. Problem was is that somewhere around 2016, 17, video streaming started to gain in popularity. And that's when suddenly Blockbuster realized that their strength was actually their greatest vulnerability because they had no control over all their franchisees. It's not like they could change all their franchisees from videos to hamburgers, for example. They couldn't change their model and move into something else because they had no control of their franchisees. And one by one, they had to watch each of their franchisees close down. And by 2020, Blockbuster ceased to exist. So their biggest vulnerability is that they actually failed to address their primary vulnerability, and that was they were heavily dependent on a franchise model. which they couldn't change. Kodak, they were founded in 1890, and for however many hundreds of years, they led the market in developing camera and photo technology. Around about 1975, they actually invented the first digital camera. And technically, what should have happened is they should have explored that and run with it, and they should have led the market. But for whatever reason, they chose to park that or not put as many resources and effort into it, and they focus more on the film and the development of film business model. And by 2000, they were the world's biggest. Of course, the digital revolution then took over, and other people came into the market and explored the digital camera angle. And by 2012, Kodak had ceased to exist. The challenge there for Kodak was is that they failed to maximize their opportunity. They were the first to come up with a digital camera. That was a massive opportunity. They should have changed the market and led the market for decades afterwards. But for whatever reason, they chose not to explore that, and that caught them out. So a large part of resilience is actually ensuring that organizations are, in fact, ready for change. The next characteristic is that of reactivity. Once we know that change is coming, once it's inevitable that a change is coming, we have to have the ability to react positively to that unfolding environmental changes. And a good example of natural systems that are good at responding to change would be those that have adaptive characteristics. For example, a hedgehog walks around with the spikes on the ground, but the instant it senses a threat, those spikes jump up almost immediately. Armadillos will roll up into a ball. We've seen certain species of animal will change characteristic or even change their color or their nature. And it's not so much the change that we're talking about, it's the speed at which the change happens. It's the speed of the response. So there are numerous animals out there that are highly reactive and inherently ready to respond. And that is where their resilience comes from. Now, if we look at an organization who has proven its resilience in terms of responsiveness, probably the most famous case study is that of the 1982 Tylenol crisis. So Johnson and Johnson were the world leaders at the time with aspirin sales, particularly in the shape of the Tylenol product. Then some fool came along and actually started tampering with the product and putting cyanide pills in the actual products on the supermarket shelves. And they went through a crisis where people were taking Tylenol home, taking the wrong pill, and actually dying. And the FBI got on top of it, and they worked out fairly quickly that it was coming from Tylenol bottles. They went and they approached Tylenol and said, look, this is what's happening. People are dying because of access to your product. Now, Tylenol didn't debate. Johnson & Johnson didn't debate it. They didn't argue with the FBI. They didn't try and blame the retailers. They didn't try and shift the blame or make out it was somebody else's fault. What they did is give the world a masterclass in crisis response. Essentially, what they did is they made an announcement that they were going to take 30 million tablets off the shelves. They then launched an intensive communication campaign to educate people as to what the threat was in place and how they were dealing it. And within a matter of weeks, they bounced forward with a new, stronger product where they came back, new branding, tamper-proof capsules, but they put them back on the shelves within a matter of weeks and with an intensive campaign saying new, improved, much stronger, much safer Tylenol is now available on your shelf. So reactivity is a large part of your ability to create resilience to disruptive forces. The fourth characteristic is that of adaptation. Once it becomes clear that change has happened and the momentum of the change is too big to alter it, then we have to adapt to a new environmental reality. And a good example of this would be all those natural systems and animals out there that use adaptation as part of their life cycle. So we've seen chameleons change color, but there are other things, frogs, butterflies, humans, we all evolve over time based on environmental circumstances. So adapting to circumstances, remaining agile, that is a large part of resilience. To give an example of an organization that has done this really well, I think the best case study would have to be, for me, Apple. So for most of you know the story, around about 1976, Apple started out with computer hardware, and they were selling computers at one stage door to door, and they built up a business from that. Then other players entered the market, the IBMs, the Dells, and that kind of thing. And the market became a little bit saturated. And famously, Steve Jobs got fired. But one opportunity or another, Steve came back to the forefold. And what they did is they changed. They changed from selling hardware to start selling innovative personal device. And that became the main staple of what they were doing for pretty much about a decade and a half. But by 2020, the organization has shifted again. It's evolved once more. Now what it does, it sells infinite user experience. It has multiple platforms. So they're no longer just about the hardware or their devices. They're actually about the experiences that they can offer. And one of the really cool things is that each of these experiences is a separate platform by themselves. So you could actually decouple something like Apple TV. If it got sold out or if it went bankrupt, they could take Apple TV out of the fold and Apple would still be an incredibly strong company for all the other platforms that they have out there. So Apple has been very, very good over the last 50 years in adapting to changing market circumstances, changing to user needs or market needs. So if we take these four characteristics that we see in the natural complex systems world, what we essentially have is a framework for achieving natural systemic resilience within organization. So in terms of discussing a particular case example of where this model could have worked, I'd like to discuss the coronavirus pandemic. Now, I realize this is an incredibly emotive and divisive topic for some, so I'm not going to get into any of the particular sensitivities. I'm going to just stick with what I think we can all agree on. If we look at where we are in the year 2022, the last 2 years have created a number of major challenges for us as a society and numerous other vulnerabilities. The way we prepared for and responded to the pandemic over the last 2 years has resulted in all these bullet points you see. So from my personal view, I don't believe we dealt with coronavirus. I believe what we did was just create numerous other vulnerabilities which we now have to deal with. So I'd like to maybe turn this on its head a bit. Let's look at a hypothetical scenario. What happens if organizations and governments had have chosen proactively to adopt this particular resilience approach? So what that would have meant is that years ago, as early as the 80s, when we started seeing the increasing signals of a potential global pandemic, the rise of HIV/AIDS, various Ebola pandemics, SARS, H1N1, mad cow disease, numerous high flu seasons. We saw numerous near misses and indicators that a global pandemic was inevitable at some point. And then imagine if they started preparing. They had have developed infrastructure, systems, action plans, and contingencies for a pandemic that we knew that was not only plausible, but actually inevitable. Imagine if we were prepared. And there was so much we could have done, from stockpiling masks and sanitizers and ventilators, which are common for most pandemics, to plans for converting army barracks into field hospitals, moving doctors and nurses around from unaffected areas. There was just so much we could have done leading up to 2020, which we didn't explore. Then imagine if in early 2020, when it became clear that a pandemic was about to happen, we simply actioned those plans. We'd been getting ready for decades. Now we just actioned it. We rolled out the plans, the supporting infrastructure, and the system. Then imagine after the first major wave, when we rolled these plans out and managed it better, we then spent the next 2 years adapting by addressing those flawed societal behaviors and supporting systems that had made us vulnerable to COVID in the first place. The reason we were disrupted by COVID is because we were vulnerable to COVID. We had numerous vulnerabilities and dependencies that didn't allow us to dodge COVID, and we needed to address that. So imagine if after the first one or two waves, we'd spent the next 2 years not locking down, but adapting to address our vulnerabilities and to actually decouple from our dependencies and change our systems and behavior so that we now became more resilient to future threats. And this then raises the question, where we stand now in 2022, after all the harm, the unhappiness, the unpleasantness, are we any more resilient or any less vulnerable to future threats? Because it's not just COVID that the world is facing. There are numerous other macro threats out there. And if we put them up against some form of a risk radar, we'll learn that they're all advancing to that hyper complex, hyper disruptive zone. So after 2.5 years of global COVID disruption, are we any more prepared? Are we any more resilient or less vulnerable for all that we've done? So I think one of the things organizations and we on a personal level have to start becoming comfortable with is that disruption is real. For the longest time, it was a bit of a buzzword: disruption, technological disruption, cyber disruption. But what we've certainly learned over the last 2 years is that disruption is a very real concept, and risk management needs to start gearing up to deal with disruption. If you have a look at these brands that I put on your screen here, if you're over the age of 40 like me, then every single one of these brands was a market leader in your lifetime. And every single one of them has been catastrophically disrupted in one way or another. Some of them quickly, some of them slowly, but they all got disrupted. So if the world's leading brands can get disrupted, your organization too can too. So what modern organizations need to start paying attention to is how can they get disrupted? And more importantly, how can they build in a natural resilience to disruption? That has to be the new requisite or the new primary goal for enterprise risk management. And organizations need to take that on board and start planning accordingly. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Quite a bit to take in there. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends and bring people to this forum. The more people following this, the more likely I am to do future content. So thank you for your time. And until next time, as always, keep safe.